The Romans were the last superpower of the ancient world. From their capital, they ruled over the entire Mediterranean region. Rome's architects, engineers, and strategists shaped this giant city, but they did not found it. Dig deep enough in Rome, and you find traces of the buildings of an earlier, mysterious civilization. A civilization the Romans tried to write out of history. But Roman historians left just enough clues for one man to pick up the trail 2,000 years later, of the Etruscans. (1881). In the tiny Tuscan town of Campiglia Marittima, Isidoro Falchi serves as both doctor and counselor. His hobby is archaeology. He's fascinated by the mysterious Etruscans who lived here before the Romans. He'd like to devote all his time to it, but he's a busy man. Today he's mediating between two local peasants in a property dispute. It's always the same story. Over the generations, conflicting traditions about the rights of use of fields and meadows have become a source of interminable quarrels among the peasants. And caught between them is the counselor, who often must make do with documents which at least one side is bound to reject as unreliable, if not downright invalid. Finally, he just has to make a ruling and trust they will agree to it. This is where the boundary will be. In the countryside around Campiglia Marittima, Isidora has often found fragments of ancient pots and vases, impossible to identify. He's also found plenty of Roman coins. But this one is different. It has an inscription he can't quite decipher. His instinct tells him it could be connected to the Etruscans. And that's something he must check right away. He can leave the two farmers to accept his decision or keep on arguing. Roman and Greek historians said that in the 7th century BC there were 12 centers of Etruscan civilization, forming a federation. By now, 1881, 11 of them have been found. The Romans called the missing settlement Vetulonia, and there was always a rumor that it must be near Campiglia Marittima. Today, Falchi's patients will have to wait. Because if this coin really is Etruscan, it could be the first solid evidence of the location of Vetulonia. Isidora has seen the Etruscan alphabet in books. It looks a bit like the Latin alphabet, except that it's written from right to left. In fact, the Romans developed their letters from the Etruscan alphabet, so it's the direct precursor of today's Western European script. Italian archaeologists have been trying to locate Vetulonia for decades, but the Romans did a good job of erasing their predecessors from history. There can be no doubt, these are Etruscan letters. They spell F-A-T-L. Fatal is short for Fatluna or Vetulonia. Many of Isidoro's patients bring him coins they find in the surrounding countryside, but none quite like this. He is a scientist. He's gathering information to be absolutely certain before he makes a public statement. Even 130 years later, Isidoro Falchi is still something of a hero and role model for Etruscanologist Simona Raffanelli.
He believed totally in his own ideas. For this reason, in particular, I admire Isidoro Falchi. Isidoro Falchi, like Schliemann for the ancient world, had the force to believe that what he taught, it was real, it was true.
Isidoro has chosen the most difficult of tasks, rediscovering and reconstructing a lost world which has left so little behind. Even today, our understanding of Etruscan civilization is a jigsaw puzzle in which many parts are missing. We only have what was built in stone, like the necropolis of Cerveteri, the city of the dead. Or these, known as the hollow roads. They crisscross the countryside, hacked up to 20 meters deep through solid rock using only axes and mattocks. What was the point of it all? No archaeologist has ever come up with a convincing explanation. Some of these paths run parallel to each other, ruling them out as transport routes. Maybe they were roads for the gods. And working out what the gods wanted was the most important task of Etruscan priests. The sound of thunder, the flight path of birds, the shape of lightning, the condition of a sacrificial animal's liver were all signs of the will of a higher power. The Romans and Greeks said the Etruscans came together once a year at a holy place to take important decisions based on the will of the gods, but they left posterity no hint where this place was. Until, in 2006, archaeologists discovered it was here at Orvieto in Umbria, right in the geographical center of Etruscan territory. A team from the universities of Macerata and Perugia had found the religious center of Etruscan life, the Fanum Voltumni. That was the name the Romans gave it. Fanum means holy place, and Voltumna was one of the Etruscans' most important gods. This was never a unified state like the ones the Romans built. The Etruscans had no capital city. The 12 settlements came together here to debate and agree future policies in the name of the god Voltumna.
It's the ancient historian Livy that tells us about the political meetings and the important political decisions that were taken at the Fanum Voltumne. He also tells us about religious ceremonies, markets, theater and sports events that were taking place in this that was the sanctuary of the Etruscans.
The location of Fanum Voltumne was the holy grail for Etruscanologists. Scholars had been searching for it since the Renaissance, even here in Orvieto, but they had never found any evidence of the exact location. These teams have now excavated 2 altars of a kind unique in the whole of Tuscany. According to Roman historians like Livy, the sacrifice would gain the goodwill of Voltumna, who rules over human destiny. Even death could be put off by up to 10 years. This extraordinary precision with time was typical of the Etruscans. If we're to believe the Romans, they even predicted their own demise. They said their civilization would last exactly 1,000 years. The earliest Etruscan remains have been dated to the 13th century BC. Archaeologists usually need an inscription to prove the identity of a place they have found. But Alba Frascarelli doesn't think they're going to find one.
The fact that Livy talks about it several times but never tells us where the Fanum was gives us the idea that the Fanum was so famous among the Etruscans and among the Romans that he did not need to say where it was. It would be like nowadays talking about the Colosseum, and you don't need to add I visited the Colosseum in Rome because everybody knows that the Colosseum is in Rome.
Instead, they're putting together all the small details that prove this was the Etruscans' most holy place. And the most convincing evidence is an inscription found in the year 2008. It's on a fragment of a vase. It's the name of the father of the gods, Apis. This, the experts believe, is almost certainly the Etruscan equivalent of the Roman name Voltumna. In 1881, the inscription on a coin tortures and fascinates Isidoro Falchi as he pursues his search for the remains of Vetulonia, the 12th Etruscan town. On one of his rare free weekends, he stops at an inn in the village of Colonna di Boriano. But asking the padrone of Colonna di Boriano's only ristorante whether he has any information on similar coins coming to light in the region merely puts the man on alert. He won't be fooled by the stranger's talk of scientific or historical value. Of course, he's seen Roman coins like this before, but they've all been duly handed over to the authorities. After all, there's a reward for finds like these, isn't there? So the padrone thinks this is a Roman coin. How so? Well, how stupid can you get? Colonna di Buriano was once a Roman city, and the characters on the coin exactly match those on the ancient wall next to the city gates. Falchi is electrified. If he is right about the origin of the coin, then the inscription on the city wall must be Etruscan too. The landlord, however, is certain there's nothing of any value there, just some old stones. And they're definitely not worth getting excited about, let alone an excuse for dashing off with an unsettled bill. The guy could at least have left some modern coins behind. Like many towns in southern Tuscany, Colonna di Buriano was built on Roman foundations. But if Isidoro finds Etruscan inscriptions here, history will have to be rewritten. He knows what to look for. The Etruscans built with great blocks of stone. This wall could easily be Etruscan. These must be the inscriptions the landlord was talking about. They look exactly like the letters on the coin. Isidoro slowly realizes that Colonna di Buriano once had a very different name. This is Vetulonia. "130 years later, philologists have learned to read the Etruscan language. They have discovered that it's based on the Greek alphabet. But deciphering longer inscriptions still takes time. Etruscan has turned out to be a language island among Indo-European tongues, completely unique with one strange exception. In 1885, a stele was found on the Greek island of Lemnos in the Aegean. "2,700 years ago, a stonemason inscribed words on a gravestone in a language extraordinarily similar to Etruscan. This discovery triggered a new debate about the origins of the Etruscans. Did they come to Italy from elsewhere? Even the ancient Romans and Greeks couldn't agree about that. Some said the Etruscans came from Troy, others from Persia. Certainly their strange expressive art makes it tempting to look for exotic origins. Professor Alberto Piazza of Turin University is the man with the skills to find out. Like Isidoro Falchi, he's not a professional researcher into the Etruscans, or even an archaeologist. Professor Piazza is a geneticist.
It's very difficult to decide on the basis of archaeological record alone. What I think is it must be more open to different and maybe completely different hypotheses, and science is really giving, and molecular biology today is given some test of hypotheses that in many cases is useful to investigate.
When Piazza was investigating the Italian genetic heritage, he discovered that the genetic makeup in one region is distinctly different. Tuscany, the place where the Etruscans were first recorded. West of Siena, Piazza selected 3 communities where he hoped to encounter Etruscan roots. Here in Volterra, they even have an Etruscan city gate. This was one of the 12 Etruscan towns.
The history of Volterra plays a very important role in the history of Etrurian and the history of Etruscan. And so from historical records were very well known. And the town, the village of Volterra is isolated enough to make us very aware of a sampling which is very meaningful from the point of view of archaeological records.
Piazza concentrated on the Y chromosome of the people of Volterra. That means he was investigating the male line. He looked for men whose forefathers had lived in the town for at least 3 generations and had surnames familiar in this region for hundreds of years. Since the 1980s, Piazza has been comparing his data with DNA from right across Europe. He's had to wait more than 20 years for the results, half a career. No time at all in the 500 years this debate has raged. Where did the Etruscans come from? In 1881, one subject was not up for debate. Any suggestion that the Etruscans could have been in any way superior to the Romans would have been laughed out of court, especially if it came from an amateur archaeologist, a Tuscan country doctor. Italy has just become a nation again. Ancient Rome is seen as the cradle of Italian culture, especially by the archaeological authorities. Falchi knows he will have to find something very special to persuade them to think again. He travels to Florence to get a license to excavate at Colonna di Buriano. After half a day in a hard chair, and with the last train leaving in about an hour, Falchi, although not unversed in dealing with the Italian bureaucracy, is no longer in the mood for diplomatic niceties. Clearly a mistake. Where did the dottore say he was from? Oh yes, Campiglia Maritima, wasn't it? But anyhow, what brings a country doctor to the venerable halls of the Antiquities Department? The superintendent is fully engaged in managing the rich cultural heritage of ancient Rome. Falchi is afraid that any leak of his discovery may lead to a most unwelcome rush of treasure hunters. He dares only whisper his sensational news, that he has found Vitalonia, the 12th city of the Etruscans. But to the man behind the desk, Falchi is just one of those amateur archaeologists whose finds, always sensational of course, are a veritable plague these days. Or at best, rather amusing. Falchi has brought nothing to show, and that's because he is no amateur. He's come to initiate a proper scientific excavation. But he's talking to deaf ears, and so, fuming and exasperated, he storms off. At the end of the 19th century, archaeology was in the hands of the Italian aristocracy. There was no room for outsiders.
If you are not a scholar or a real archaeologist, it's difficult just now to be listened by the other scholars, by the other modern archaeologists. Falchi should found meet a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems, just because it was only a doctor.
It's often tough for pioneers. That hasn't changed in the last 130 years. For a long time, the archaeological establishment was skeptical about Alberto Piazza's research. How could blood tests and DNA analysis do what the experts had failed to establish on site among the remains? By 2007, Piazza had analyzed 15,000 DNA samples from all over Europe. The result was a genetic map which established the Tuscan men from Volterra and other former Etruscan towns were most closely related to a tiny population group living near the island of Lemnos in western Anatolia, once known as Lydia, which is remarkably close to a description by the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus. When famine and poverty spread in Lydia hundreds of years ago, the people traveled west through Greece to Italy. This question had split the experts for literally thousands of years. Finally, it was answered.
There is a long discussion about that, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus has a theory of an autochthonous origin, and Herodotus has a completely different history from Anatolia. And it's very difficult to think about very old records for mythological narrative, but we think that probably Herodotus was right.
Whether that is really the end of the argument remains to be seen. But there is one thing everyone agrees on. The Etruscans were different. It wasn't just that their architecture looked different. They had a different attitude to life. No Etruscan houses remain, but archaeologists do know how they designed their houses, even how they decorated their rooms, because their tombs were exact replicas of the insides of their homes. On the walls of the Tomb of Reliefs in Cerveteri, archaeologists found stone copies of the departed's belongings, status symbols of an important citizen. Even his bed and those of his wife and children have been carved into the walls. The Etruscans slept on soft pillows. Just like in the tombs of ancient Egypt, Etruscans should lack for nothing in the next life. Next to the bedroom was the living room. Luxury, parties and dances, all an accepted part of Etruscan life. Something their neighbors couldn't forgive them for. The Greeks and Romans found it scandalous. Greek historian Theopompus, perhaps he deserved his name, said group sex was de rigueur for the Etruscans, and no Etruscan man could be sure if he was the father of his children. As recently as 1960, the tomb of chastisement was found in Tarquinia. It seemed to confirm the cliché. It's difficult to be sure whether the Etruscans really did lead a debauched existence. We have so little written material from the Etruscans themselves. The wall paintings are the only real evidence for today's scholars. In Tarquinia, Cornelia Weber-Lehmann has spent years studying the paintings in more than 60 tombs. Sadly, just like in the pharaohs' tombs, increasing humidity is making the paintings fade faster and faster. To record and research the information in the paintings, Cornelia's artist colleague painstakingly copies the outlines on a transparent sheet with a marker pen.
Cracking this code, deciphering this picture language is a wonderful challenge, especially in the tombs where you can barely see anything with the naked eye.
One thing becomes clear. The Etruscans' jealous neighbors and competitors in Greece and Rome picked out salacious details of their lives in order to discredit them. By far the majority of pictures show men and women relaxing together at table.
Today, we can read something quite different in these pictures. Companionship in marriage, a delicate relationship with a touch of the erotic that served above all to keep the family together and to strengthen the clan.
Etruscan women were independent. They had their own money and possessions. Roman women were completely subservient to their husbands. This was an astonishingly modern form of a society for ancient times, a sophisticated, life-loving culture. It must have been particularly annoying to the Romans. In almost all respects, the Etruscans were a step ahead of them. Insights like these make the tiring work in the human sticky tombs more than worthwhile. Even after 30 years, Cornelia can still be surprised. This illustration of a banquet from 490 BC shows more than just the table manners of the Etruscan elite. It's the oldest depiction of a table in human history.
There's a boy dressed in white, and he's approaching the table to serve the guests with wine. Under the table, you can see plates and bowls used for washing, so we know that the guests probably washed their hands before coming to the table. That's something we just didn't know before.
1881. On this night raid with his son Andrea, Isidoro doesn't need to interpret what he finds. He just has to unearth objects. There's no other way to get a license to dig to find Vetulonia. Falchi is forced to go against his own principles. Will they be the first, after 2 millennia, to disturb the peace of the bodies once buried here? Isidoro can trust no one except his own son. A few weeks ago, beneath the town walls of Colonna di Buriano, they had come across a concealed wall. Isidoro is sure it must be the outside wall of an Etruscan hill tomb. Tonight, under cover of darkness, this town councillor will break into the tomb. Isidoro hopes that by presenting the authorities with a fait accompli, he will make them give him his license. If he's lucky, this could be an undisturbed tomb, and then he could find incredibly rare Etruscan artifacts. But if grave robbers have been here before him, no one will believe him, and he himself could be in trouble with the law.
Andrea, come.
Carefully, Falchi starts to examine what lies in front of him. It seems to be intact. It's a rare piece of good luck. Tonight, Isidoro and his son are themselves the grave robbers. The Etruscans laid their funerary goods on wooden tables. The wood has long since disappeared, but some of the objects remain. Among them is a weapon, a battle axe, it seems. This alone would be a major find. But then Falchi and Andrea notice something special. The axe is elaborately crafted. and it is made of iron. This must have been the tomb of an important person. On the bed of the departed is the helmet of a man who died more than 2,500 years ago. The helmet too is made of iron. Isidoro knows that the Etruscans were skilled craftsmen, and he knows that funerary goods are rarely so well preserved. Finds like this must be near a town like Vetalonia, the missing link in the history of the Etruscans.
Ich denke,
He's certain that the antiques
überlege,
department
ob
will
wir
listen to
bekommen.
him and finally grant him a license. The Etruscans were so skilled in metalwork and produced so much that their weapons and artworks were in demand well beyond their original homeland. As their prosperity grew, they founded town after town. By the 6th century BC, they had established themselves in an area from the Po Valley to Campania. For a long time, the big question was iron the decisive factor in their expansion? And if it was, where was it made? The trail leads to Populonia, opposite the island of Elba. Populonia was the only Etruscan town that actually lay on the coast. Today, nothing at all remains of Populonia here in the Bay of Barati. But what you can find everywhere are traces of ancient iron production. 2,500-year-old remains of a layer of slag that once covered the land meters thick and made archaeological investigation impossible. Until 1910, when a mining company began removing the slag to extract the remaining iron ore. They uncovered more and more tombs. Archaeologists tried desperately to halt the work.
It was a race just because obviously the companies working here don't want to lose time. And archaeologists on the state and so on tried to get more it was possible because they knew that they couldn't stop the companies, but they want to save much stuff it was possible.
The archaeologists managed to save some of the most impressive tombs from the miners' pickaxes. The slag had covered the tombs with an airtight layer, conserving them and protecting them from grave robbers. Circular tambour tombs with a diameter of 40 meters were revealed, constructed by Populonia's super-rich upper class, who controlled the iron mining, smelting, and manufacturing. At first, there was no sign of the workplaces of what must have been a big industry. But now, high above the coast, archaeologists are excavating the ancient metal workshops and smelting ovens. Archaeologists knew that the Etruscans mined and made a lot of iron, but they're only just beginning to discover how much. Silvia Guideri is a specialist in ancient metals. She's been sifting through the layers of slag for 5 years.
They have been working more or less 2.5 million tons of iron ore, and from this quantity they get more or less 700,000 iron. That is really an impressive quantity.
Today, the Bay of Barati is a picturesque coastal landscape. In ancient times, this was the center of a huge industry that smelted and worked iron for the entire Mediterranean. The sky was black with smoke from hundreds of smelting ovens. More and more slag was produced. Over 2 centuries, the bay was covered with 1 million cubic meters of black slag. It formed a solid layer over the ground in the tombs that lasted for 2,500 years. A new place had to be found for the dead. The city planners made a virtue out of necessity and transformed the quarries above Populonia into tombs for the privileged classes. But compared to the giant graves on the coast, the narrow shafts in the quarries offered little space. The dead must not stand in the way of the Etruscans' industrial development. Here, the prosperity of the living was more important than life after death. This town became the Etruscans' most important trading center. Metal was exported from Populonia to the entire Mediterranean region. The most significant trading relationships were with the Greeks and the Phoenicians. In return, the most desired import was Greek pottery. If an archaeologist today finds Greek pottery in this region, it's a sign of a tomb of a wealthy Etruscan. After his first successful tomb raid near Colonna di Boriano, Isidoro Falchi excavates more and more tombs. Now, at last, he has a license. The authorities can no longer ignore him. Apart from objects of iron and pottery, he has also found a delicate brooch known as a fibula. This was the most important piece of jewelry for an Etruscan woman. It's the showpiece of his excavations. Every week, officials from Florence inspect what Isidoro has unearthed and claim the most valuable pieces for themselves. Isidoro's license works entirely to the benefit of the authorities. The head of the Antiquities Commission still doesn't believe Falchi's theory that he has discovered Vetulonia. The finds may be quite nice, the superintendent says, and will make a welcome addition to the exhibits already in his museum. But where is the city Falchi claims to have located? Tombs and graves do suggest a necropolis. That much he will admit. But to prove the existence of a city of the living, there should be traces of streets, foundations of a house, remnants of the city gates, walls, something like that. Here, there are merely graves. As long as Isidoro can produce no solid evidence of the town, he remains, in their eyes, a fortunate amateur. But Falchi hasn't shown them everything he's found. He's had men digging uphill from the tombs, and they've hit walls that quite clearly belong to a town, and not to more graves. The officials are, for once, speechless, but not for long. Rather condescendingly, Falchi is invited to join in for the official photograph. The superintendent is prepared to include Falchi in case this discovery makes headlines, but he rather hopes it won't, as then he would have to publicly acknowledge that Falchi was right all along. He is still unwilling to admit that the country doctor from Campiglia Marittima has indeed found Vetulonia. "We shall see," are his final words on that day. Falchi can't keep from quipping, "Sir, that's the first time you've been right." Falchi digs on. He finds more and more walls of Etruscan houses. Entire sections of an ancient town are revealed that had completely disappeared off the map. From Falchi's excavations, we can at last tell what the town looked like and how people lived here. Along a fortified street, Falchi found the remains of atrium houses. They opened onto the street and had tiled roofs. It's a style of building the Romans later copied. Just as in the tombs of the great necropoles, the owners of these houses took great care with the interior decoration. And the inhabitants of Vetulonia, or their slaves, didn't even have to leave their houses to fetch water. For the first time in 2,500 years, the name Vetulonia regained its rightful place on the map. Isidoro Falchi had triumphed. Apart from the name, there's little to remind visitors of this town's rich history. Today, less than 1,000 people live in Vetulonia, and there is no visible evidence of the Etruscans. The walls that Falchi identified 130 years ago still stand at the entrance to the town. And though Falchi correctly identified Vetulonia, maybe he didn't get everything right.
When Falchi, at the end of 19th century, found this tall and monumental and big wall, he thought it was a city wall, without doubt. Now the modern scholars, the modern archaeologists, and me too, think that this could be a base for a big temple of the city.
The wall is only 30 meters long. That's very short for the fortifications of an important town. Etruscan temples discovered in other locations support Simona's hypothesis. Their walls are exactly 30 meters long. What Falchi thought were city walls are in fact the foundations of a temple. Bit by bit, Simona Raffanelli is continuing the excavation of Vetulonia. She's carrying on where Falchi's work stopped at his death in 1914. And perhaps, quite soon now, the whole story of this Etruscan city can be told. Because new discoveries of Etruscan and Roman coins in the same layers of earth suggest that the end of Vetulonia, or the Etruscan Fotul, was quite different than hitherto believed.
The finding of coins, Roman and Etruscan together, is very important for us modern archaeologists today, because these coins teach to us that in the last century of the story of Vatl, Roman and Etruscan live together in the peace.
According to the ancient sources, war raged for 150 years between the Etruscans and the Romans. One Etruscan town after another was conquered, until in 264 BC, the Romans stood before the gates of Orvieto, the Etruscan spiritual center. The city on the cliffs that the Etruscans called Velsna was destroyed. But what happened to the sacred site at the foot of the cliffs? The Roman invaders knew this was the sanctuary of the Etruscans' chief god, Voltumna. Was it the site of a fierce, last-ditch struggle between the two civilizations? Examining layers from many hundreds of years of history, archaeologists found a tiny relic that suggests a far less violent end to Etruscan civilization than the Romans like to publicize. It's a small bronze statuette of a human figure. The surprise is in its date, which makes it clear that it wasn't an Etruscan who brought this offering to the shrine.
This body of bronze statuette is significant because we can date it to after the Roman conquest of Velsna. So this proves that the Romans were still using the sanctuary, were still donating votive offerings to the sanctuary itself. So it means that they wanted to keep it alive, and this only happens when a sanctuary, a sacred place, was most significant and important.
The Etruscans in Orvieto were eventually resettled by the Romans elsewhere, but the Romans kept alive the cult of their most important god. Perhaps it was because the Etruscans' gods had proved so effective at foretelling their future. According to the prophecies of their priests, Etruscan civilization would last for 10 epochs. After that, their civilization would disappear into the darkness of history. Ten Etruscan units of time, a little less than 1,000 of our years. According to Etruscan legend, an iron nail was hammered into the wall at the temple in Orvieto every year as a sign of time slipping away. This Etruscan bronze mirror illustrates the legend. The half-naked winged goddess Norcia swings her hammer with one hand, while the other holds the nail. The prophecy of the Etruscan priests proved eerily accurate. The 1st century BC was the last century of the Etruscans. After that time, we have no trace of the Etruscan language. A people that enjoyed the fine things in life and preferred peaceful coexistence and trade to war and conquest walked off the stage. The Etruscans simply disappeared into the expanding Roman Empire. The Romans built over their towns, and they in turn gave way to other invading tribes. Although the Etruscans left few traces to be found by archaeologists, look closely enough, and the signs of their legacy are everywhere. Their spirit lives on in Tuscany. In spite of his remarkable discoveries, Isidoro Falchi was never recognized by the archaeological establishment. In his will, he wrote to his son, "I now pass on the excavation of Vetulonia to you. Study Latin and Greek, and absorb all the knowledge of the ancient world. But do not become a doctor, because then nobody will take you seriously, and you will never become an archaeologist."